If you were alive in 1994, you remember the first time you heard Morgan Freeman's voice narrate Red's story in Shawshank Redemption. That voice didn't just tell a story, it wrapped around you like a warm blanket, made you believe in redemption, made you trust that good things could happen even in the darkest places. For an entire generation, Morgan Freeman wasn't just an actor. He was the voice that made sense of chaos. He narrated the March of the Penguins, he explained the mysteries of the universe, he played God and somehow made it believable. When you heard that voice, you relaxed, you trusted, you believed. But here's what almost nobody knows. That iconic voice, the one that became synonymous with wisdom and authority, almost never existed in Hollywood, because in 1955 a young man named Morgan Freeman had a completely different dream. He didn't want to be an actor. He didn't want to narrate movies. He wanted to fly fighter jets for the United States Air Force. And when that dream was shattered in the most brutal way possible, it set in motion a chain of events that would eventually give the world one of cinema's most unforgettable voices. Before we dive into this incredible journey, if you appreciate deep dives into the untold stories of Hollywood legends, hit that subscribe button. This is the kind of story that changes how you see everything. June 1st, 1937, Memphis, Tennessee. Morgan Freeman was born into a world that didn't expect much from black children in the American South. His father was a barber who drank too much. His mother was a teacher who moved the family constantly, chasing work, chasing stability, chasing something that always seemed just out of reach. By the time Morgan was a teenager, he had lived in Mississippi, Indiana, and back to Tennessee again. The family never had money, they never had security. But young Morgan had something else, an imagination that could transport him anywhere, and a fascination with the machines that dominated the skies above America. The 1950s were the golden age of aviation. World War II had just ended, and the pilots who had flown those missions were returning home as heroes. Jet technology was advancing rapidly. The sound barrier had been broken, and for a young black teenager watching planes fly overhead in Memphis, those machines represented something profound: escape, freedom, a way out of poverty, and the suffocating racism of the Jim Crow South. Morgan Freeman became obsessed with flying. He would spend hours at the library reading about aircraft, studying aerodynamics, memorizing the specifications of every fighter jet in the American arsenal. His teachers noticed his intelligence, his focus, his determination, but they also noticed something else. This boy didn't just want to learn about planes. He wanted to fly them. In 1955, when Morgan was 18 years old, he made a decision that he believed would define his entire life. He turned down a partial drama scholarship to Jackson State University, a scholarship that would have put him on stage, that would have trained that voice everyone would later fall in love with. Instead, he walked into an Air Force recruitment office and enlisted. He was going to become a fighter pilot. He was going to serve his country. He was going to fly. What happened next would haunt him for decades. The young airman basic Morgan Freeman arrived at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, in the summer of 1955 with his head full of dreams and his heart full of determination. He had passed all the entrance exams. He had the intelligence scores. He had the physical fitness. On paper, Morgan Freeman was exactly what the Air Force was looking for in a pilot candidate. But 1955 America wasn't about what was on paper. It was about the color of your skin. The Air Force had officially desegregated in 1948, 7 years before Freeman enlisted. President Truman's Executive Order 998-1 had declared that all military personnel should receive equal treatment regardless of race. But official policy and actual practice were two very different things. In 1955, the Air Force had only a handful of black pilots, and the institutional resistance to training more was fierce. The Tuskegee Airmen had proven during World War II that black pilots could fly as well as anyone. But old prejudices died hard, and young Morgan Freeman was about to discover just how hard. During his initial training evaluation, something happened that Freeman would rarely discuss in interviews, but that clearly left a deep scar. He was given a familiarization flight, a chance to go up in an aircraft with an experienced pilot, to get a feel for what flying was actually like. For most pilot candidates, these flights were thrilling introductions to their future careers. For Morgan Freeman, it was the moment his dream died. He later described the experience in one brief interview. "I realized at that moment that I didn't want to fly. I wanted to watch people fly." It was a diplomatic way of describing what those close to him later revealed was a devastating realization. He wasn't going to be allowed into the pilot program. The reasons were never explicitly stated. There was no official rejection letter saying because you're black. That's not how institutional racism worked in 1955. Instead, there were quiet redirections, suggestions that perhaps he'd be better suited for other roles, administrative delays that somehow never got resolved. Other white recruits from his intake class moved smoothly into pilot training. Freeman was assigned to radar operations. But here's the part of the story that almost nobody talks about, the part that reveals something crucial about Morgan Freeman's character. He didn't quit. He didn't become bitter and walk away from the Air Force. He didn't let the rejection destroy him. Instead, he spent the next 4 years learning a different skill, one that would, in a strange and unexpected way, prepare him for the career he was actually meant to have. Freeman was stationed at various Air Force bases between 1955 and 1959 working as a radar technician. It was tedious, technical work, sitting in dark rooms, watching screens, tracking aircraft movements, communicating coordinates to pilots and controllers, hour after hour, day after day, watching the sky through electronic eyes instead of his own. For most people, this would have been soul-crushing monotony. But Freeman discovered something unexpected in that radar room. He loved the sound of his own voice over the radio. Air Force radio communication has to be precise, clear, authoritative. Every word matters. Every transmission could mean the difference between a safe landing and a catastrophe. Freeman found that his natural speaking voice, deep, measured, deliberate, was perfect for this work. Controllers complimented him on his radio presence. Pilots said his instructions were the clearest they'd heard. And slowly, without even realizing it, Morgan Freeman was training the instrument that would make him famous. He was learning breath control, vocal projection, how to convey authority and calm simultaneously. He was developing the voice. But he was also learning something else, something darker and more complex. He was learning how to perform for an audience that couldn't see him. Over the radio, Morgan Freeman was just a voice, disembodied, raceless, judged only on competence and clarity. It was probably the first time in his life that his blackness didn't immediately precede him into a room. And this created a strange duality in his developing identity. On the base, in person, he was a young black airman navigating a still segregated military culture. But over the radio, he was just Freeman, the guy with the great voice, the one you could count on. By 1959, Morgan Freeman had completed his Air Force service and was facing a question that many young veterans face. What now? He was 22 years old. He had no college degree. His dream of becoming a pilot was dead. But those 4 years in radar rooms had taught him something unexpected about himself. He loved the power of voice, the way words and tone could create entire worlds in someone's imagination. And he remembered something from high school that he had almost forgotten. He had been good at drama. Really good. Freeman moved to Los Angeles, a city where thousands of aspiring actors arrived every year with dreams and left with broken hearts. He had no connections, no agent, no training beyond some high school plays. What he had was the GI Bill, which gave him access to acting classes, and a voice that, as one early teacher noted, could make a grocery list sound like Shakespeare. He enrolled in acting classes at Los Angeles City College and began the grinding, humiliating work of trying to break into show business as a young black man in early 1960s America. The entertainment industry in 1960 was, if anything, even more segregated than the military. Black actors were relegated to stereotypical roles: servants, criminals, comic relief. The idea of a black leading man was virtually non-existent. Sidney Poitier was just beginning to break through, but he was the exception that proved the rule. For every Poitier, there were hundreds of talented black actors waiting tables and driving taxis, hoping for a chance that would never come. Freeman took whatever work he could get. He danced in a revival show. He did bit parts in off-Broadway productions when he moved to New York in 19... He appeared in an all-black production of Hello, Dolly. He played the role of an illiterate soldier in an off-Broadway play called The Nigger Lovers, a title that reflected the brutal racial politics of the era. Nothing was glamorous. Nothing paid well. There were weeks when Freeman couldn't afford to eat properly. There were months when he seriously considered giving up and finding a regular job. But then something happened that nobody expected. Something that would keep Morgan Freeman in the acting world even as it threatened to trap him in a gilded cage that could have destroyed his career before it really began. In 1971, a new children's educational program called The Electric Company was looking for actors. It was designed to teach reading to elementary school children, produced by the Children's Television Workshop that had created Sesame Street. The show needed performers who could be engaging, energetic, and work with complex educational material. At 34 years old, ancient by children's television standards, Morgan Freeman auditioned and landed a role. He would play multiple characters, but the one that became iconic was Easy Reader, a funky, hip character who made reading cool. For the next 5 years, from 1971 to 1976, Morgan Freeman was on national television every day. Millions of children across America watched him. He was finally making steady money, finally had job security, finally had recognition. His easy reader character became beloved. Kids loved him, parents knew his face. But here's the devastating irony. This success was killing his serious acting career before it could begin. Hollywood casting directors didn't see Morgan Freeman as a serious dramatic actor. They saw him as the guy from the kids' show. The same visibility that should have opened doors was closing them. When he auditioned for film roles, he was told he was too recognizable as easy reader. When he tried to get cast in serious theater, directors couldn't see past the funky costumes and exaggerated expressions of children's television. Freeman had traded his fighter pilot dream for an acting career, and now his acting career was being suffocated by the very success that was supposed to save it. The late 1970s and early 1980s were Morgan Freeman's wilderness years. He was working constantly but going nowhere. He did small roles in soap operas, Another World, The Edge of Night. He appeared in forgettable films with titles nobody remembers. He took theater roles that paid barely enough to cover rent in New York. He was in his 40s now, an age when most actors who haven't made it start seriously considering other careers. And Freeman was acutely aware that for black actors the window of opportunity was even smaller than for white actors. But something was happening during these invisible years, something that only became clear later. Freeman was becoming an extraordinarily skilled actor, not a star. He had no stardom, not famous. Outside of people who remembered Easy Reader, nobody knew who he was. But skilled, master-level skilled. He was working constantly in theater, doing classical Shakespeare, contemporary drama, everything he could get cast in. And that voice, the one he'd been training since his Air Force days, was becoming something remarkable. In theater, Freeman discovered that his voice could do something unusual. It could command attention without shouting. It could convey wisdom without condescension. It could be both powerful and gentle simultaneously. Directors started casting him in roles that required vocal authority, kings, fathers, mentors, and Freeman was learning how to inhabit these characters completely, how to make audiences forget they were watching Morgan Freeman and believe they were seeing the character. Then, in 1987, everything changed because of a pimp. A small independent film called Street Smart was being cast. The director Jerry Schatzberg was looking for someone to play Fast Black, a violent pimp who terrorizes a journalist. It was a supporting role, but it was showy, dramatic, the kind of part that could get attention if done right. Freeman auditioned and brought something to the character that nobody expected. He made Fast Black intelligent, charismatic, genuinely frightening because of his intelligence rather than despite it. He didn't play Fast Black as a stereotype. He played him as a human being who had made monstrous choices. The performance was explosive. Critics who had never heard of Morgan Freeman suddenly couldn't stop talking about him. Who is this actor? Reviews asked. Where has he been hiding? At 50 years old, Morgan Freeman received his first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. 50 years old. Most actors who become stars do it in their 20s or 30s. Freeman had spent 3 decades in obscurity, honing his craft, perfecting that voice, waiting for his moment. And suddenly, impossibly, the moment had arrived. What happened next was a masterclass in how preparation meets opportunity. Because Morgan Freeman wasn't just good in Street Smart. He was undeniable. And Hollywood, which had ignored him for decades, suddenly couldn't get enough of him. In 1989, he starred in Driving Miss Daisy as Hoke Colburn, the patient chauffeur to Jessica Tandy's stubborn Southern lady. The role earned him another Oscar nomination and introduced his talent to mainstream audiences who had never heard of Street Smart. But it was 1994 that cemented Morgan Freeman's voice as a cultural institution. 2 films released that year would define his legacy and prove that the radar operator who had been denied his pilot dreams had found something even more powerful than flight. First came The Shawshank Redemption. Freeman played Red, a prison inmate serving a life sentence who becomes the film's narrator. Director Frank Darabont had always envisioned the role being narrated, and Freeman's voice was perfect, weary but not defeated, cynical but not hopeless, a voice that had seen the worst of humanity but still believed in redemption. When Freeman's narration describes Andy Dufresne's escape and talks about hope, about Zihuatanejo, about choosing to get busy living or get busy dying, audiences didn't just hear words, they heard wisdom, they heard truth, they heard exactly what Morgan Freeman had been preparing to deliver his entire life. The film was a commercial disappointment when it was released, but something unexpected happened. On video, on cable television, Through word of mouth, Shawshank Redemption became one of the most beloved films in American cinema, and Morgan Freeman's voice became inseparable from the experience. People quoted Red's lines. They imitated Freeman's delivery. That voice became shorthand for wisdom and redemption. The second film that year was The Road to Freedom, the Vernon Johns story, but more importantly, 1995 brought C7, where Freeman played Detective Somerset, the world-weary cop investigating serial murders. Once again, his voice carried moral authority, gravitas, the sense that this was a man who had seen darkness but maintained his humanity. And then Hollywood discovered something remarkable. Morgan Freeman's voice could sell anything. Suddenly, Freeman wasn't just an actor, he was a brand. His voice began appearing in documentaries, in commercials, in narration work that paid enormous sums. He narrated March of the Penguins, and his voice made a documentary about Antarctic birds into a box office success. He played God in Bruce Almighty, and somehow it worked because if God had a voice, of course it would sound like Morgan Freeman. He played Lucius Fox in Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, the voice of reason and technology. He narrated The Story of God, a religious documentary series, and nobody questioned the irony of an agnostic actor explaining faith traditions. By the 2000s, Morgan Freeman's voice had transcended acting. It had become a cultural reference point. Comedians did impressions of it. Memes celebrated it. GPS apps joked about offering Morgan Freeman voice options. When people needed to convey authority, wisdom, or gravitas, they wanted it to sound like Morgan Freeman. Here's the profound irony that Morgan Freeman himself has acknowledged in rare reflective interviews. Everything he became, everything that made him iconic, grew directly from the dream that was denied to him in 1955. When the Air Force rejected his pilot aspirations and stuck him in front of radar screens, they were inadvertently training him for exactly the career he was meant to have. Those hours in dark radar rooms, speaking clearly and authoritatively into microphones, taught him vocal control that drama school never could have. The discipline of military service, the patience required to sit through long shifts doing technical work, gave him the work ethic that sustained him through decades of obscurity. The disappointment of having his dream crushed taught him humility and determination, and perhaps most importantly, being invisible, both over the radio in the Air Force and during his long years of struggling in Hollywood, taught him something essential about acting. It's not about being seen, it's about being heard. It's not about your face, it's about the truth you convey. Freeman has said in interviews that he doesn't regret his Air Force years, even though they represented the death of his first dream. If I had become a pilot, he once noted, I would have been just another pilot. But this voice, this thing I developed partly in those radar rooms, became something unique. There's no bitterness in his reflection, just the wisdom of a man who understands that sometimes our greatest disappointments redirect us toward our actual destiny. The young man who wanted to fly fighter jets never got to touch the clouds at 30,000 feet. But the voice he developed while tracking those flights, the authority he learned while guiding pilots safely home, eventually carried him to heights that no aircraft could reach. Morgan Freeman didn't conquer the skies. He conquered something far more difficult. He conquered Hollywood's racism, its ageism, its tendency to pigeonhole black actors into stereotypes. And he did it not with his face or his body, but with the instrument he had spent decades perfecting in obscurity. Today, Morgan Freeman is in his late 80s, and that voice is still working. He continues to take roles, to narrate documentaries, to lend his authority to projects that need gravitas. But more importantly, his career path has become a template for understanding something crucial about success and dreams. Freeman's story isn't the typical Hollywood narrative. He didn't get discovered at 20 and become a star by 30. He didn't have a breakout moment that instantly changed everything. Instead, he spent decades being invisible, being rejected, being told he wasn't right for roles, being stuck in career dead ends like children's television. And every single one of those experiences, especially the Air Force years that crushed his pilot dreams, contributed to making him the artist he eventually became. The radar operator from 1955 who wanted to fly but was denied that dream became the voice that narrated some of cinema's most important films. The struggling actor who couldn't catch a break until he was 50 became one of the most respected performers of his generation. The man who was told he was too black, too old, too pigeonholed, too anything, became the voice that defined wisdom and authority for millions of people around the world. There's a scene in The Shawshank Redemption where Red talks about hope, about how it's a dangerous thing in prison, how it can drive a man insane, and then later, after Andy escapes, Red changes his mind. "I hope," he says in that voice we all know, "I hope to see my friend and shake his hand. I hope the Pacific is as blue as it has been in my dreams. I hope." That moment, delivered in Morgan Freeman's voice, has made millions of people cry. It's been quoted in graduation speeches, played at funerals, referenced in countless contexts, as the definitive statement about not giving up hope, even when circumstances seem impossible. And it's impossible not to see the connection to Freeman's own life. The young man whose pilot dreams were crushed, but who never stopped hoping, who spent decades in obscurity but never stopped working, who was told repeatedly that his moment had passed but who kept showing up until the world finally listened. The Air Force rejected Morgan Freeman as a pilot in 1955. They told him implicitly, if not explicitly, that he wasn't good enough, that he didn't belong in the cockpit. But what they couldn't see, what nobody could see at the time, was that they weren't crushing his dream. They were redirecting it. They were forcing him toward the path he was actually meant to walk. And on that path, in those radar rooms and struggling years and decades of obscurity, Morgan Freeman was becoming something far more powerful than a pilot. He was becoming a voice that would outlast any aircraft, that would reach more people than any flight could carry, that would touch more lives than any military service could achieve. The young radar operator who watched planes fly through electronic screens eventually learned to fly in a completely different way, not through the air but through cinema. Through that voice, through the accumulated wisdom of patience and persistence and refusing to let rejection define him. And when you hear Morgan Freeman narrate anything, a documentary about penguins, a story about redemption, an explanation of the universe itself, you're hearing the voice of a man who learned the most important lesson life can teach. Sometimes the dreams we lose make room for destinies we never imagined. That's the untold story of Morgan Freeman's voice. Not the story of a star who always knew he'd make it, but the story of a rejected pilot, a struggling actor, an invisible man who spent decades preparing for a moment he couldn't have predicted. And when that moment finally came, when the world finally listened, the voice they heard was worth every year of waiting, every disappointment, every rejection. Because it wasn't just a voice, it was the sound of persistence, of dignity, of a man who refused to let anyone else's limitations define his possibilities. The Air Force said he couldn't fly. Morgan Freeman spent the next 60 years proving that there are more ways to soar than anyone realized.